Some time ago, I was reading an article that spoke about the American businessman Herman Cain. Cain grew up in the mid-1940s in Memphis, Tennessee. He came from a family that he described as poor but happy. His parents, though struggling with things, provided for him and his brothers. There was always a roof over their head, food on the table, and both he and his brother were sent away to college. In fact, Cain received 2 different degrees over his years and then entered into the business world. And at one point, for about a decade, he was the CEO of Godfather's Pizza. In the article, he was interviewed and asked what was a major influence in his success. And he said that there were in fact 2 men that inspired and influenced him in a tremendous way. He said the first man was his father, who had oftentimes, as he was growing up, worked 3 or 4 jobs in order to provide for his family. His father was not afraid of hard work and did whatever it was that was necessary in order to provide for his family. Cain said the other man that influenced him was the president of the college that he attended for his first degree. This president not only encouraged and supported him and acted as a mentor, but he also shared with him a poem that he had written. And that poem, Cain said, stayed with him all of the days of his life. And the poem is entitled, "Life is Just a Minute." And it goes as follows. Life is just a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon you, you cannot refuse it. Don't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You must suffer if you lose it. Give an account if you abuse it. Just a tiny little minute, but eternity in it. Cain said that these words often inspired him to use each and every moment of his life, each and every opportunity, so that he could not only advance himself and his family, but his community and the world that he lived in. I think the example of both his father and the words of this poem help us to enter into our scriptures this weekend, as each of the 3 readings speak to us about people that used their time well and used what they had to be able to make a difference in the lives of others. As we gather on this 33rd Sunday of Ordinary Time, we recognize that our liturgical year is quickly drawing to a close. And each year, as we near this time, our readings then remind us of end times and last things, not to frighten or to scare us, but instead to ready and prepare us. Recall last Sunday we heard the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, 5 that were wise, 5 that were foolish. And through that parable, Jesus reminded us of the need and the necessity to be ready and prepared at all times. This evening we hear the parable of the 3 stewards and how they were entrusted with their master's wealth and how they were called to use it in the present moment so that it could reproduce an abundant harvest for him on his return. And next Sunday, as we gather to celebrate our last Sunday in our liturgical year, we will hear that final parable of Jesus, the separation of the sheep from the goats, and we will be reminded about accountability and judgment. And so as the Church presents to us all of these readings over these weeks, it is meant to do so to help us to ready and encourage ourselves to be able to adopt the same attitude that we hear of St. Paul in our second reading as he is writing to the early Christians in Thessalonica, reminding them not to be concerned about end times, but simply to be able to live in the present moment, doing the good that they are called to do, and then entrusting everything else in God's hands. St. Paul closes our reading tonight with a reminder that they are to stay awake and to stay sober, to be alert and attentive to the present moment. And this ultimately is the message that Jesus was speaking about in the parable this evening, as he spoke to his disciples long ago and still to us today. We hear that the master of the household was preparing to go on a long journey, and he entrusted to 3 of his servants his wealth. To one he gives 5 talents, to another 2, to the last he gives 1, each according to their own ability. And then he goes off to conduct his business. And when he returns back, he asks for an accounting of his servants, of how it is that they used the talents, how it is that they took care of his investment. We hear that the first of the servants returned not only the 5 talents, but made 5 more talents. And we hear not only of the joy of the master, but he commends the servant and rewards him for his hard work and creativity. In a similar way, we hear that the second servant that was entrusted with 2 talents returns not only the 2 talents, but an additional 2. And again, we hear of the master's joy and the recognition that he gives to the servant. But then, sadly, we hear about the last of the servants. He was entrusted with 1 talent. But we hear that the servant was fearful or afraid. He was fearful or afraid that he might lose it, that he might squander it, that his master would not be pleased with him. And so instead of doing something with the talent, he simply buries it for safekeeping. And we hear that he presents that final talent back to his master. The master is filled with a sense not only of disappointment, but of anger, because he squandered the master's resources and did not do what he was supposed to do. And not only does he lose the talent being given to the one who had made 5 more talents, but we hear that he experiences condemnation and judgment because of his inability to be able to produce and to use the present moment. Jesus used that parable long ago and still tonight for us, not to teach us about investment strategies, but moreover about strategies of how it is that we are to grow our spiritual lives, that God has given to us in and through the gift of our baptism and confirmation, the call to be his disciples, to be able to build and to transform the world more and more into his kingdom. But how is it that we use those abilities, that time, to be able to build God's kingdom? Are we good stewards of the time, the talent, the treasure that God has given to us, utilizing the present moment? Or are we fearful and afraid, like that last servant, and simply bury our time, our talent, and our treasure, not doing the good that we are called to do, not building up the kingdom, not being Jesus' disciples? And so the challenge and the invitation that was placed before Jesus' disciples and also before us is to take a look at how it is that we are using our time, our talent, and our treasure. And in our first reading this evening, we hear the sacred author raise up to us an example of someone who used her time, her talent, her treasure well. We hear the sacred author speak about this capable wife. Not only was she capable because she took care of her children and her husband, took care of their household, but moreover because she also was creative and industrious. She also had a deep love for the poor and the needy. And moreover, in the midst of all of that, she is raised up as an example because of the wisdom that she had, that she was one who had a fear, a reverence of the Lord. In other words, God was at the center and the heart of her life. And because God was at the center and the heart of her life, she was able then to use her time, her talent, and her treasure to be able to love God, to love her neighbor, and to love herself, as the great commandment calls each and every one of us to do. And this is why this capable wife is raised up as an example of how it is that we are called to live our lives, that we too are called to keep God at the center and the heart of our lives, to have that fear of the Lord, to be able to reverence God and God's will in our lives. And in order for us to do so, then we must keep him at the center and the heart and use each and every moment, each and every opportunity that he has given us to be able to serve him and others and to be able to build up his kingdom in the here and now so that one day we might enjoy it for all of eternity. And therefore, as our liturgical year is drawing to a close, these three parables that we hear in St. Luke's Gospel become perhaps an examination of conscience for us as we take a look back at this past liturgical year, inquiring to ourselves how it is that we have embraced this great commandment, loving God, loving our neighbor, loving ourselves. Have we this past year grown in the gift of our faith, grown in the gift of our discipleship, grown in the gift of our service? Have we used well our time, our talent, our treasure? Have we used well this minute that God has given us to be able to love and to serve him, like the capable wife, like the two servants at the beginning of the gospel? Or have we allowed ourselves to become like that third servant in the parable, fearful and afraid, unwilling to use our time, our talent, and our treasure in the way that God has called us to? It is a choice and an invitation for each and every one of us to recognize how it is that we are to be fruitful, faithful, intentional disciples of the Lord Jesus, and that it often begins in the here and now, in the daily tasks of our lives. And so we recognize, as Herman Cain did, that life is just a minute, only 60 seconds in it, forced upon you, can't refuse it, didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You must suffer if you lose it, give an account if you abuse it. Just a tiny little minute, but eternity in it.